Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we explore the hidden and fascinating stories of American history. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from the past. Tonight, we take you back to a chilling New Year's Eve, a night that changed the course of one southern plantation forever. This is the story of New Year's Eve, the enslaved woman who took vengeful justice with an axe. The winter of that year had arrived earlier than most remembered, a bitter chill settling over the small plantation like a warning. Snow dusted the gnarled branches of the oaks and magnolias, and the wind whispered through the fields where the enslaved toiled in silence. There was a sense of waiting in the air, an unspoken tension that had long simmered beneath the surface of the plantation's polished facades. On the surface, life seemed ordinary to the casual observer, the masters tending to their affairs, the estate maintained in neat rows of crops and livestock. But beneath that veneer, a dark undercurrent of fear, oppression, and silent resentment ran through the quarters where the enslaved lived. She had been born into bondage, her earliest memories filled with the endless chores of tending to the household, caring for children who were not her own, and enduring the constant threat of punishment for even the slightest misstep. Her name had been chosen by the masters, as though the act of naming her were another layer of ownership. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the overseer's eyes were elsewhere, she imagined a life beyond the boundaries of the estate, a world where the weight of chains did not press upon her back and soul. The woman, strong in ways that few could see, had learned early how to survive in a world built to suppress her. She had watched as families were torn apart, as the weak and the sick were discarded or broken, and she carried these observations like embers, small, burning reminders of injustice. There were moments when despair threatened to swallow her, but those same embers became a quiet fire of determination. She studied the rhythms of the house, the habits of those who held power over her, and the patterns of the men who patrolled the grounds. Every glance, every word, every careless laugh of the masters became a piece of a puzzle she would one day assemble. As the plantation prepared for the new year, the household bustled with activity. The masters had plans for celebration, their minds full of excess and indulgence, blind to the humanity that labored unseen in the shadows. There were feasts, music, and laughter that seemed to mock the quiet desperation of those who served them. The enslaved woman moved among them, unseen but not unobservant, noting who would retire early, who would guard the doors, who drank too freely and fell into predictable stupors. She memorized each detail, each lapse in vigilance, and tucked them away in her mind like precious tools for a future she did not yet dare to speak aloud. Her life on the plantation had been a careful balance of obedience and endurance, but the new year brought with it an old, unspoken truth. Time could shift, and opportunities could arise in the most ordinary of nights. She had waited years for a moment when the scales of power, so heavily weighted against her, might tip, even if only for an instant. In the cold, silent hours before midnight she prepared herself, her hands brushing against the smooth wood of the kitchen door, the handle of the axe kept in the far corner where it was rarely disturbed. She had not spoken of it, not even to herself, until the timing was perfect. Now, she imagined it with meticulous care, planning for each step, each consequence, aware that a single miscalculation could destroy any hope of freedom. Outside, the snow fell heavier as the evening deepened, blanketing the fields in muted white, muffling sounds, creating an eerie stillness. The masters grew increasingly careless, the night swelling with their sense of entitlement and the warm haze of drink. They laughed louder than they should, clinking glasses, shouting across the dining hall. And she waited, silent and poised, a figure of quiet determination, feeling the weight of years of injustice settle like stones in her chest. In that cold, fragile darkness she felt the world narrow to a single purpose, the moment when her patience, her suffering, and her resolve could finally intersect in an act that would change the course of her life, and the history of the household, forever. By the time the clock ticked closer to midnight, the preparations of the household, the frivolity of the masters, and the hush of the enslaved quarters had all converged in a tense stillness. She could hear the distant fireworks, the faint echoes of celebration beyond the fields, signaling a turning of the year. To the masters, it was a night of joy and excess. To her, it was a night of reckoning, one that had been waiting in the shadows for years, hidden in the careful calculations of a mind sharpened by injustice and fortified by endurance. And as the final minutes of the year slipped by, she tightened her grip on the axe, feeling its weight not as a burden but as a tool of inevitability. In that silent, frostbitten air, she stood poised between the world that had sought to suppress her and the moment when history itself would bend to her resolve, a silent witness to the storm about to be unleashed. The night held its breath, the plantation unaware that it teetered on the edge of chaos, on the brink of a dark and unforgettable reckoning. The night had deepened into a heavy darkness, broken only by the flickering candlelight that cast trembling shadows along the walls of the grand house. The masters had grown careless in their celebrations, their laughter echoing through the halls, blending with the distant howling of the wind outside. Drunk with power and drink, they had forgotten the sharp, watchful eyes that followed their every move. She moved silently through the corners of the house, the cold biting at her skin, every step deliberate, every breath measured. The axe, hidden beneath a coarse cloth in the far corner of the kitchen, felt heavier in her hands now, weighted with the years of suffering, fear, and anger that had accumulated in her heart. She remembered each insult, each lash, each bitter word spoken over the years. The cruel games of the masters, the children torn from their mothers, the hunger and exhaustion inflicted as punishment, all these memories sharpened her resolve. She did not act in blind rage. Every motion had been rehearsed in the quiet hours, every decision weighed against the consequences. She understood the stakes. This was not simply a night of rebellion, but a night that could claim everything she had endured and transform it into something irreversible. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the celebration, creating a strange, almost sacred silence. She paused for a moment, listening to the faint murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, the low hum of music that floated from the main hall. In that stillness, she could almost hear the pulse of the household, feel the careless confidence of the masters as they celebrated another year of their power. She tightened her grip on the axe again, feeling the rough handle press into her palms, grounding her, reminding her that tonight she held the power to change the story that had long been written for her. As the clock in the hall chimed closer to midnight, the masters staggered through their revelry, oblivious to the figure moving silently in their midst. She had chosen her moment carefully, the household divided by indulgence, the servants distracted, the doors unguarded. Each step she took was guided by years of observation and an instinct honed by survival. She moved with the quiet precision of someone who knew the house as intimately as her own body, slipping through corridors, staying in shadows, avoiding creaking floorboards and careless eyes. The first master she encountered had slumped into a chair, asleep from overindulgence, a careless smile frozen on his face. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the immense gravity of what she was about to do. Every nerve in her body was alive, every memory of injustice burning in her mind. She raised the axe, poised to strike, but paused for a heartbeat to witness the face of the man who had wielded power over her entire life with cruelty. The years of humiliation and suffering pressed down on her, and in that suspended moment, the weight of history seemed to hang in the room with her, heavy and tangible. When the strike finally came, it was swift, precise, and final. The sound of wood meeting flesh was muffled by the thick walls, but in that instant, the power dynamic of the household shifted irrevocably. Shock rippled through the remaining masters and servants alike, but she did not hesitate. She moved with deliberate purpose, her actions guided by both instinct and meticulous planning. Each encounter was carefully measured, each step calculated to minimize chance and maximize control over a situation that had long been dictated by others. As the night unfolded, she navigated the house like a shadow, a force born of necessity and determination, reshaping the power that had always been stacked against her. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by occasional cries and the dull thud of blows that ended long-standing tyranny. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, indifferent to the violence and reckoning taking place within the walls of the plantation. The stark contrast between the silent, cold landscape and the fiery, chaotic events inside the house amplified the enormity of her actions. Every moment, every breath, was an assertion of agency she had been denied for years. The fear that had long been instilled in her through pain and oppression now served her as a guide, sharpening her senses, heightening her awareness. She moved through the rooms with a grim determination, aware that hesitation could undo everything, aware that history could hinge on her courage and precision. And as the final moments approached, the quiet house seemed to hold its breath, the weight of centuries of oppression balanced on the edge of a single, decisive night. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the aftermath of her actions had transformed the household into something unrecognizable. The echoes of her vengeance lingered, heavy and profound, a testament to the years of suffering that had culminated in this single night. She stood alone in the cold, snow-covered world outside the house, the axe still in her hands, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of survival, resilience, and the power of a woman who had been denied every measure of control over her own life. The plantation, once a place of rigid order and cruelty, now lay quiet, forever marked by the actions of one who had dared to defy a system built on her subjugation. The first rays of sunlight glinted weakly across the snow-covered fields, painting a cold, gray light over the plantation. The night's horrors had ended, but the world she emerged into was far from peaceful. The snow, pristine and untouched, seemed almost cruel in its indifference, covering the traces of what had unfolded within the house, erasing the evidence from the eyes of anyone who might wander near. Yet the house itself was silent in a way that carried its own weight, a heavy quiet that spoke of absence, of lives abruptly ended, and of a power long taken for granted now overturned. She stood on the edge of the yard, the axe in her hand, the wind biting at her face, and she allowed herself a long, deep breath. Freedom, if it could be called that, felt bitter and heavy. News traveled faster than any of the masters could have imagined. By mid-morning, neighbors who had once looked upon the plantation as a symbol of wealth and dominance began to murmur in disbelief. The tale of the New Year's Eve massacre spread from mouth to mouth, carrying with it both fear and fascination. People spoke in hushed tones about the audacity of the woman who had dared to strike back against the ones who had ruled her life with cruelty. Some whispered about divine retribution, others about the madness that must have taken hold in the dead of night. And amidst these whispers, she remained a shadow, moving quietly, careful not to attract attention, aware that curiosity could quickly turn to suspicion or violence. The local authorities, when they finally arrived, were met with a scene that few could have anticipated. The house bore the signs of chaos, the remnants of struggle evident in every room, yet there was no disorder in her presence. She had moved with precision, with a cold, deliberate intent that left little chance for error. To the officials, the events must have seemed almost unreal. The power of one woman, long enslaved, had toppled the authority of those who had once ruled with impunity. Some of the onlookers could not reconcile the image of a single figure standing against an entire household with the rigid social hierarchies they had always known. Within the enslaved quarters, the reaction was a mixture of fear and awe. Some whispered her name with reverence, speaking of her courage in tones usually reserved for legends. Others trembled, worried that the repercussions would be swift and brutal, fearing that those who survived, or those beyond the plantation, might exact vengeance. Yet even in the midst of this fear, a sense of possibility began to stir. For years, lives had been dictated by those who held power, but this night had shown that the chains could be challenged, that the voice of one determined soul could resonate far beyond the confines of a single household. The woman herself remained guarded, aware that her actions had created as many dangers as they had liberated her from. She knew that the world beyond the plantation was still largely hostile, that freedom in its truest form would not come easily, and that survival required more than courage, it required wit, stealth, and unshakable resolve. She spent days in the outskirts of the property, observing movements, listening to the whispers of travelers, watching as rumors solidified into narrative. Some spoke of her as a ghost, a phantom of vengeance that would haunt the plantation forever. Others told more practical stories, painting her as a warning to any who might contemplate cruelty. In either case, her presence, though unseen, had become a force that could not be ignored. But history, as she would come to understand, is never a simple recounting of events. The story of that night would be told and retold, transformed and reshaped by those who survived, by those who sought to make sense of a world upended in an instant. Some would diminish her role, portraying the massacre as an accident or the result of madness. Others would elevate her to myth, a figure of justice and terror whose actions could not be measured by ordinary means. She herself, however, carried no illusions. She had acted out of necessity, out of the raw and unyielding need to claim power over her own life, and that truth, sharp and unflinching, was the only reality that mattered to her. As weeks turned into months, the plantation changed irrevocably. The land bore witness to the absence of the masters, and the enslaved quarters were filled with a cautious sense of new order. There were questions, of course, and investigations that came and went, but the woman had vanished into the margins of the world, leaving only the memory of her night of reckoning behind. To the authorities, she was a criminal to be pursued. To some of the local population, she was a figure of folklore, a symbol of resistance and survival. To herself, she was simply a person who had endured more than any one person should, and had finally acted when the moment demanded it. And yet, even in this relative silence, the echoes of that night remained. Every creak of the floorboards in the abandoned house, every footprint in the snow outside, every whispered story carried the weight of what had transpired. She had struck a blow against oppression, yes, but she had also become a part of the history of the land, a living testament to the power of human resilience, anger, and cunning. The New Year's Eve massacre would never be forgotten, not by those who witnessed its immediate effects, nor by those who would hear of it in the decades to come. It was a story that would linger, haunting and instructive, a reminder of both the cruelty of the past and the indomitable spirit that could rise in response to it. Years passed, and the memory of that New Year's Eve remained etched into the land, the snow-covered fields, and the minds of those who had survived to tell the tale. The woman herself had disappeared into the wider world, a figure who had become almost mythic, spoken of in whispers along country roads, in kitchens, and in the hushed conversations of travelers. She carried with her no sense of triumph in the way the world might define it. Her vengeance had been a necessity, a reclamation of self in a life that had afforded her little autonomy, and yet the weight of what she had done never fully lifted. Each day of freedom was accompanied by the echoes of that night, the faces of the men who had ruled her life, the cold steel of the axe, and the impossible knowledge that justice had come at such a human cost. The plantation itself changed irrevocably. Without its masters to enforce strict hierarchy, the land became a strange mix of silence and cautious reinvention. Some of the surviving workers left, seeking new opportunities, while others stayed, aware that the old order had been shattered and that a different, unpredictable reality awaited. The house, once the center of absolute control, became a symbol of what happens when power is abused and patience runs thin. The local community, initially stunned into disbelief, began to tell the story over and over, each retelling shaping the woman into a figure larger than life, a cautionary tale, a hero of resistance, a ghostly specter of revenge. She herself moved carefully through the wider world, keeping to the edges, learning to navigate towns and back roads, always aware of the precariousness of freedom for someone like her. She found work where she could, relying on her strength and her wits, her past never far behind her, the weight of memory a constant companion. Yet she also carried something precious that no one could take, autonomy over her own life. She had survived, and in surviving, she had claimed a piece of herself that slavery had tried, and failed, to destroy. Her story, though hidden from the public record, was a quiet but powerful testament to resilience. The impact of her actions rippled through generations. Stories of her courage and cunning spread not just as local legend but as part of the broader tapestry of resistance and survival in American history. Her night of vengeance became a touchstone, a grim reminder that cruelty and oppression, no matter how entrenched, could be challenged. Families who had heard the stories spoke of her not only in terms of fear but also as inspiration, a demonstration that even in the darkest circumstances, human agency could prevail. Her legacy lived on, quietly, in the awareness that one person, no matter how oppressed, could alter the course of events in ways that would never be forgotten. Historians, when they later pieced together fragments of the event, marveled at the audacity, the meticulous planning, and the raw courage required to act as she had. They noted the historical significance, not simply in terms of the deaths she caused, but in the symbolic shift her actions represented, a crack in the facade of absolute control, a moment when the oppressed claimed a form of justice that the world around them had denied. And while her name may not appear in many formal records, the essence of her story endured, carried in oral histories, whispered tales, and the lingering memory of that New Year's Eve when one woman, armed with nothing but determination and an axe, reshaped her destiny. In the quiet moments, long after the snow had melted and the plantation had changed hands, she remembered the night with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and resolute pride. She had acted not from cruelty, but from the inescapable need to assert her humanity, to respond to a lifetime of injustice. And in doing so, she had left an indelible mark on the history of her time, a testament to the resilience of those who have been denied power, and a chilling reminder that even the most entrenched systems can be confronted by a determined soul. The story of that night, carried forward through generations, remained vivid and haunting, a narrative of oppression met with courage, of silence broken with decisive action, and of a woman who, in the cold hours of New Year's Eve, reclaimed her life with an axe and an unyielding spirit. It was a story that would endure, not for the spectacle of violence, but for the powerful truth it held, that even in the darkest chapters of history, human courage and resolve can light a path that no force can fully extinguish.